Sarah Martinez stood at the front door of 1247 Maple Grove Drive, holding the keys to her childhood dream home, the same house her ex-husband had forced her to sell 3 years earlier in their bitter divorce. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. While he had walked away with what he thought was the prize, she had just paid cash, $1.2 million in cash, to buy back the Victorian home that had once represented everything she'd lost. But what happened next would change everything. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't getting mad. It's getting even, and Sarah had just pulled off the ultimate comeback story that would leave everyone speechless. The woman who opened that door expecting to pay rent that morning had no idea she was about to face the new owner, the same woman whose marriage had been destroyed within these very walls. The look of shock and recognition in her eyes told the whole story. But this was just the beginning of a transformation so remarkable that it would prove sometimes losing everything is exactly what you need to find out what you're truly capable of. Meet Sarah Martinez, a 34-year-old elementary school teacher from Austin, Texas, who thought she had her life figured out until the day her husband of 8 years decided their marriage wasn't worth fighting for. Standing 5 feet 6 inches tall with shoulder-length brown hair and the kind of warm smile that made children gravitate toward her classroom, Sarah had always been the type of person who believed in playing by the rules, working hard and trusting that fairness would prevail. She had grown up in a modest household where her parents taught her that a home wasn't just 4 walls and a roof. It was where dreams took shape and families grew strong. In the spring of 2019, after years of saving every penny from her $42,000 teacher's salary and combining it with her husband David's income as a marketing manager, they had finally purchased their dream home on Maple Grove Drive. The 3-story Victorian, built in 1924, featured original hardwood floors, stained glass windows, and a wraparound porch that Sarah had fallen in love with the moment she saw it. At $650,000, it stretched their budget thin. But Sarah saw it as an investment in their future, a place where they would raise children, host family gatherings, and build a lifetime of memories. What she couldn't have known was that within 3 years, this same house would become the battleground for the most painful chapter of her life, and later, the symbol of the most incredible comeback story you've ever heard. The stakes couldn't have been higher, not just her financial future, but her belief in herself, her capacity to rebuild from nothing, and her ability to prove that sometimes the person who loses everything is the one who ends up winning it all. The story you're about to hear isn't just about real estate or revenge. It's about discovering that your greatest strength often emerges from your deepest pain, and that sometimes the best way to move forward is to reclaim exactly what you thought you'd lost forever. If you've ever felt like you've lost everything and wondered if you could ever bounce back, Sarah's journey will show you that not only is it possible, but the comeback can be even better than the original dream. Before we dive into this incredible transformation, if stories like this inspire you to see challenges as opportunities, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell, because we share real stories about real people who turned their setbacks into comebacks. And definitely let us know in the comments what your biggest comeback moment has been, because everyone has a story of resilience worth sharing. Life for Sarah Martinez in 2019 felt like everything she had worked toward was finally falling into place. Every morning at 6:30, she would wake up in the master bedroom of 1247 Maple Grove Drive, make her way to the kitchen with its vintage tile backsplash, and prepare coffee while looking out at the garden she had planted along the side of the house. The routine was simple but satisfying. Scrambled eggs for David, who preferred to eat quickly before his commute to downtown Austin, and oatmeal with fresh berries for herself, eaten while reviewing lesson plans for her 3rd grade class at Riverside Elementary. The house had become more than just a home in those early months. It had become Sarah's canvas for the future she envisioned. She had spent weekends refinishing the original hardwood floors in the living room, carefully stripping away layers of old paint from the intricate crown molding, and researching period-appropriate fixtures for the dining room chandelier. David would often joke that she cared more about the house than she did about him, but Sarah brushed off the comments as typical husband humor. She believed they were building something together, creating a foundation for the family they had talked about having once they were more financially stable. Her days at Riverside Elementary were filled with the kind of moments that reminded her why she had chosen teaching. There was Marcus, a shy 8-year-old who struggled with reading until Sarah discovered he learned better when lessons incorporated his love of dinosaurs. There was Isabella, whose parents spoke primarily Spanish at home, and who blossomed when Sarah took the time to learn basic phrases to communicate with her family. The salary of $42,000 wasn't much, especially in a city like Austin, where the cost of living seemed to rise monthly. But Sarah found purpose in the work that money couldn't measure. Evenings in the Victorian home followed a predictable pattern that Sarah cherished. She would arrive home around 4:15, grade papers at the antique desk she had found at a local estate sale, and start dinner by 6. David typically returned by 6:30, sometimes later when he had client meetings or office events. They would eat together in the dining room, discussing their days, making plans for home improvement projects, and dreaming about eventual renovations that would add a master suite above the garage. The mortgage payment of $3,200 per month required careful budgeting, but they managed by combining their incomes and living modestly in other areas. Sarah drove a 7-year-old Honda Civic, packed her lunch every day, and found creative ways to furnish their home through garage sales and online marketplaces. David contributed his salary of $68,000. Though Sarah noticed he had become increasingly focused on advancing his career and less interested in the domestic life they were building together. Weekends were Sarah's favorite time in the house. Saturday mornings meant farmers' market trips to select fresh flowers for the dining room table, followed by hours working in the garden where she had planted tomatoes, herbs, and a small flower bed along the front porch. She had installed a porch swing the previous fall, and Sunday afternoons often found her there with a book and a cup of tea, watching neighbors walk their dogs and feeling deeply grateful for the life she was creating. But if Sarah had paid closer attention to certain details, she might have noticed signs that her carefully constructed life was beginning to show cracks. David had started working longer hours, often claiming client dinners and networking events that seemed to occur with increasing frequency. His phone, once casually left on counters and tables, was now constantly in his possession. Conversations about their future, once frequent and detailed, had become shorter and more focused on immediate concerns like household repairs and monthly bills. There were also financial tensions that Sarah tried to ignore. David had started making comments about the mortgage being too large a portion of their income, despite the fact that they had carefully calculated their budget before purchasing. He began questioning expenses that previously hadn't bothered him. Sarah's occasional splurges on antique furniture, the organic groceries she preferred, even the modest amounts she spent on classroom supplies for students whose families couldn't afford them. The social dynamics of their marriage had shifted as well. Though Sarah attributed the changes to natural evolution rather than warning signs, David's colleagues and friends had become more central to his life, while Sarah's world remained anchored in her classroom and their home. When they did socialize together, Sarah noticed David seemed distant, checking his phone frequently and appearing eager to leave early. She told herself he was just stressed about work, that the pressure of the mortgage and career advancement was affecting his mood. During the summer of 2021, 2 years after they had moved into the Victorian home, Sarah had planned a week-long staycation focused on major home improvement projects. She had saved money throughout the school year to refinish the kitchen cabinets, update the bathroom fixtures, and install new lighting in the living room. David had initially agreed to take time off work to help, but as the week approached, he announced that a major client project required his attention and he would be working through most of their planned time together. Sarah completed the projects alone, finding satisfaction in the physical work and the visible improvements to their home. She documented the process with photographs, imagining how she would show the before and after pictures to their future children, telling the story of how she and their father had lovingly restored every room. The kitchen cabinets, originally painted white but yellowed with age, emerged a beautiful sage green that complemented the vintage tile. The bathroom, previously dark and cramped feeling, was transformed with new fixtures and strategic lighting that made the space feel twice as large. When David returned home each evening that week to see the day's progress, his reactions were polite but notably underwhelmed. Sarah had expected him to share her excitement about the improvements, to appreciate the time and effort she had invested, to see the work as an investment in their shared future. Instead, he seemed almost annoyed by the changes, making comments about the cost of materials and questioning whether the improvements were really necessary. The final project of that week was installing a new front door, a beautiful wooden door with glass panels that allowed natural light into the entryway while maintaining the home's period character. Sarah had found it at an architectural salvage yard, and the owner had given her a detailed history of its origin from a 1920s mansion that had been demolished in downtown Austin. As she worked to hang the door properly, adjusting the hinges and ensuring it closed smoothly, she felt a deep sense of accomplishment and connection to the house. But what happened on the final day of that week would mark the beginning of the end of everything Sarah thought she knew about her life. David came home earlier than usual, around 5:30, and found Sarah putting the finishing touches on the front door installation. Instead of acknowledging her work or celebrating the completion of the projects, he stood in the driveway looking at the house with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read. "We need to talk," he said, and something in his tone made Sarah's hands stop working on the door hardware. This wasn't the voice of a husband coming home to admire his wife's improvements to their shared home. This was the voice of someone who had made a decision, and as Sarah would soon learn, that decision would change everything about the life she had so carefully built within those Victorian walls. What happened next would set in motion a chain of events so devastating that Sarah would question everything she thought she knew about love, fairness, and her own ability to survive. But it would also plant the seeds for a transformation so remarkable that 3 years later, she would be standing in that same doorway as the homeowner once again, having learned that sometimes losing everything is exactly what you need to discover what you're truly made of. "I want a divorce." The words hung in the summer air like smoke, distorting everything Sarah thought she understood about her life. David stood in their driveway, still wearing his work clothes, car keys in his hand, as if he might need to make a quick escape. Sarah's grip tightened on the screwdriver she had been using to adjust the new door, the metal warm from hours of work under the Texas sun. "What?" The word came out as barely a whisper because surely she had misheard. Surely her husband of 8 years hadn't just announced he wanted to end their marriage while she stood covered in sawdust from spending a week improving the home they shared. "I've been thinking about this for months, Sarah. We're not happy. I'm not happy." David's voice carried the tone of someone who had rehearsed this conversation, who had prepared for questions and objections. "We want different things. We've grown apart." Sarah set down the screwdriver with trembling hands and walked toward him, searching his face for any sign that this was some kind of cruel joke or temporary crisis that they could work through together. But his expression was set, determined, almost relieved, as if a burden he had been carrying was finally being lifted. "David, what are you talking about? We can work through whatever problems we're having. We can go to counseling. I've already spoken to a lawyer." The second blow landed even harder than the first. This wasn't an impulsive decision or an emotional outburst. This was calculated, planned, already in motion. Sarah felt her legs weaken, and she reached for the porch railing to steady herself. "You've what? When? How long have you been planning this?" "Sarah, please don't make this harder than it needs to be. We both deserve to be happy, and we're not happy together anymore. I've found someone else." The third revelation hit like a physical punch. Not only had David decided to end their marriage, not only had he consulted lawyers without telling her, but there was another woman. Sarah sank onto the porch steps, the same steps she had painted just 3 days earlier while imagining future mornings spent there with coffee and newspapers. "Who?" she managed to ask, though part of her didn't want to know. "Her name is Jessica. She works at the agency. We've connected in a way that you and I haven't in years." "Jessica." Sarah tried to place the name among the colleagues David had mentioned over the years, but her mind was reeling too much to focus. How long had this been going on? How many of those late nights and client dinners had actually been spent with another woman? How many lies had she believed while she worked on their home, planning their future, believing in their partnership? "I don't understand," Sarah said, and she truly didn't. "We just bought this house. We've been working on it together. We talked about having children, about growing old here. How can you just throw all of that away?" David shifted uncomfortably, looking anywhere except at his wife's face. "The house is part of the problem, Sarah. We overextended ourselves. The mortgage is too much, and you're so obsessed with fixing it up that we can't enjoy our lives. I feel trapped." "Trapped?" Sarah's voice rose for the first time. "We saved for 3 years to buy this house. Every decision we made was together. You said you loved it too. I thought I did, but I was wrong. And now we're stuck with payments we can barely afford on a house that needs constant work, and I can't do this anymore." What followed were 3 of the most painful months of Sarah's life. David moved out the following week, staying temporarily with a friend while he looked for his own apartment. Sarah was left alone in the Victorian home that had represented their shared dreams, now feeling cavernous and filled with reminders of a future that would never happen. The legal proceedings began immediately, and Sarah quickly learned that her husband's consultation with a lawyer had been thorough. David wanted to sell the house as quickly as possible and split the proceeds. His attorney argued that the mortgage was too large for either party to maintain alone, and that liquidating their primary asset was the most practical solution for both of their financial futures. Sarah hired her own attorney, Margaret Chen, a family law specialist who had been recommended by a colleague at school. Margaret's office was in a nondescript building downtown, and their first meeting took place on a Wednesday afternoon in late August. Sarah had taken a personal day from teaching, something she rarely did, to discuss the divorce proceedings that were consuming her thoughts and affecting her ability to function normally. "Your husband's position is straightforward," Margaret explained, reviewing the documents David's attorney had filed. "He wants to sell the marital home, divide the proceeds equally, and separate your finances completely. He's not seeking spousal support, and he's waiving any claim to your teacher's pension." "But I don't want to sell the house," Sarah said, her voice breaking slightly. "It's our home. It's everything I worked for." Margaret's expression was sympathetic but realistic. "Sarah, your individual income as a teacher is $42,000 per year. The mortgage on the house is $38,400 annually, plus taxes, insurance, and maintenance. Even if you could qualify to assume the mortgage alone, which is unlikely given your debt-to-income ratio, you'd be spending more than 90% of your gross income on housing." The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. Sarah had known their budget was tight, but she hadn't fully grasped how dependent their lifestyle had been on David's income. Without his $68,000 salary, keeping the house wasn't just impractical, it was impossible. What if I got a second job? What if I tutored evenings and weekends? What if I— "Sarah," Margaret interrupted gently, "even if you could somehow make the payments, you'd be working constantly just to afford to live there. You'd have no money for food, utilities, car payments, or any kind of emergency. It's not sustainable." As September arrived and the new school year began, Sarah found herself trying to maintain normalcy in her classroom while her personal life disintegrated. Her third graders noticed that Mrs. Martinez seemed sad sometimes, and several asked if she was sick or if someone in her family had died. The questions weren't wrong. Someone had died. The version of herself who believed in fairness, who trusted that working hard and being a good person would be rewarded, who thought she understood what love meant, that person was gone. The house became both a sanctuary and a torture chamber. Sarah would come home each day to rooms full of improvements she had made with her own hands, projects completed with love and hope for a future that no longer existed. The kitchen cabinets she had refinished were beautiful, but they reminded her of the week she had spent alone while David was supposedly working late. The front door she had installed with such pride now felt like a symbol of her naivety. She had been working to improve their home while he had been planning to leave it. Evenings were the hardest time. The house felt enormous and empty, filled with echoes of conversations and laughter that would never happen again. Sarah would sit on the porch swing she had installed, watching neighbors return home to their own families, and wonder what she had done wrong. Had she been too focused on the house and not attentive enough to her marriage? Had she missed signs that David was unhappy? Had she somehow driven him to find someone else? The divorce proceedings moved forward with efficiency that felt cruel to Sarah. David wanted everything settled quickly so he could move forward with his new relationship, and his lawyer pushed for rapid resolution. By October, it became clear that Sarah would have no choice but to agree to sell the house. Her savings account, which had been carefully built up for improvements and emergencies, was being depleted by legal fees and the reality of maintaining a household on a single income. The most devastating blow came in late October, when Sarah learned through Margaret that David and Jessica had been looking at apartments together, specifically a luxury complex in downtown Austin that cost more per month than Sarah's entire teacher salary. While Sarah was being forced to give up the home she loved because it was financially impractical, David was planning to spend even more money on rent for a place to share with his new girlfriend. "It's not fair," Sarah said during one of her meetings with Margaret, and the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "No, it's not fair," Margaret agreed. "But divorce rarely is. The goal now is to protect your interests as much as possible and help you move forward." But what happened next would test Sarah's ability to survive in ways she never could have imagined. The housing market in Austin had softened since they bought the house in 2019, and the initial appraisals came in lower than expected. After paying off the remaining mortgage balance, real estate commissions, legal fees, and other costs associated with the sale, Sarah's share of the proceeds would be approximately $87,000. $87,000 to represent 8 years of marriage, 3 years of mortgage payments, countless hours of labor improving the home, and all of her dreams for the future. It felt like being paid minimum wage for a life that had been worth so much more. But what Sarah didn't know was that this devastating loss would become the foundation for a transformation so remarkable that in less than 3 years, she would be in a position not just to buy back her dream home, but to do it with cash, proving that sometimes losing everything is exactly what you need to discover what you're truly capable of achieving. The for sale sign went up in the front yard of 1247 Maple Grove Drive on a gray November morning in 2021. Sarah stood at her bedroom window, watching the real estate agent hammer the metal post into the ground she had once planned to plant with daffodils. The agent, a cheerful woman named Patricia Williams, had assured Sarah that Victorian homes in their neighborhood were highly desirable and that they should expect significant interest from potential buyers. Sarah had nodded and signed the listing agreement, but watching that sign go up felt like watching someone place a tombstone over everything she had believed about her life. Within hours, the first showing was scheduled. Strangers would walk through her home, examining her handiwork, judging her choices, and calculating whether the life she had built was worth purchasing. The house sold in 6 days. The buyers were a young couple from California, relocating to Austin for tech jobs that paid more in a year than Sarah made in 3. They fell in love with the refinished hardwood floors, the carefully restored kitchen cabinets, and especially the front door that Sarah had installed during that final week of her marriage. They offered full asking price and requested a 30-day closing, eager to move in before the holidays. Sarah signed the acceptance papers in Margaret's office on a Wednesday afternoon, her hands shaking as she initialed each page. 30 days to find a new place to live, pack up 8 years of shared belongings, and say goodbye to the only home she had ever truly loved. The buyers had even asked if some of the antique furniture could be included in the sale, particularly the dining room table and the vintage desk where Sarah had spent countless evenings grading papers and planning lessons. They're offering an additional $3,000 for the furniture, Margaret explained. It would save you the trouble of moving it, and frankly, you'll need the money. Sarah agreed, because Margaret was right. She needed every dollar she could get. Finding an apartment in Austin that she could afford on a teacher's salary had proven more challenging than she had anticipated. The city's rapid growth had driven up rental prices, and decent one-bedroom apartments in safe neighborhoods were now costing between $1,400 and $1,800 per month, nearly 40% of her take-home pay. She eventually found a small, one-bedroom unit in a complex called Cedar Creek Apartments, located about 15 minutes further from her school than the Victorian home had been. The apartment was clean but generic, with beige carpet, white walls, and the kind of fixtures you might find in any rental property built in the 1990s. The rent was $1,350 per month, which left Sarah with a tight but manageable budget for everything else. Moving day arrived 3 days before Thanksgiving. Sarah had hired 2 college students to help load a rental truck with the belongings she was keeping, mostly clothes, books, kitchen essentials, and a few pieces of furniture that held sentimental value. Everything else was either sold, donated, or included in the sale of the house. The hardest moment came when she had to hand over the keys. Patricia Williams met her at the house for a final walkthrough, clipboard in hand, checking that all agreed-upon items had been left behind. Sarah walked through each room one last time, remembering the projects she had completed, the dreams she had harbored, the life she had thought she was building. In the kitchen, she touched the sage-green cabinets one final time, remembering the satisfaction she had felt when the final coat of paint had dried perfectly smooth. In the living room, she looked up at the crown molding she had spent an entire weekend stripping and refinishing, work that had left her shoulders aching but her heart full of accomplishment. At the front door, she turned the handle she had installed with such care, feeling the smooth operation of hinges she had adjusted until they worked perfectly. "It's a beautiful home," Patricia said, and Sarah could hear that she meant it. "You clearly put a lot of love into it." "Yes," Sarah replied, her voice barely steady. "I did." She placed the keys in Patricia's palm and walked to her Honda Civic, parked in the driveway for the last time. As she backed out onto Maple Grove Drive, Sarah looked in her rearview mirror and saw the Victorian home growing smaller, but she didn't allow herself to cry. Not yet. She needed to stay functional long enough to get to her apartment and unload the truck. The apartment felt impossibly small after 3 years in the Victorian home. Sarah's few remaining pieces of furniture looked lost in the generic space. And the silence was different. Not the comfortable quiet of a house with character and history, but the hollow quiet of temporary shelter. She spent Thanksgiving alone for the first time in her adult life, eating a turkey sandwich and trying to convince herself that this was a new beginning, rather than an ending. December brought new challenges that Sarah hadn't anticipated. The divorce settlement had been finalized, and her share of the home sale proceeds, $87,000, was deposited into her savings account. It was more money than she had ever had at one time, but instead of feeling wealthy, she felt terrified. This money represented her entire safety net, her only protection against unexpected expenses or job loss, her only chance to maybe someday own a home again. The psychological impact of the divorce began to hit harder once the legal proceedings were complete, and she was alone with her thoughts. Sarah found herself second-guessing every decision she had made during her marriage. Had she been too focused on the house and not attentive enough to David's emotional needs? Had she been naive to trust his commitment to their shared goals? Had she somehow driven him away with her obsession with home improvement projects? Sleep became difficult in the apartment. The walls were thin, and she could hear neighbors coming and going at all hours. The heating system was loud and inefficient, creating a constant low-level noise that made rest elusive. Sarah would lie awake thinking about David and Jessica, wondering if they were happy in their downtown apartment, wondering if he ever thought about the home they had shared or regretted his decision to leave. Her performance at school began to suffer in ways that concerned her deeply. Sarah had always prided herself on being fully present for her students, but now she caught herself losing focus during lessons, forgetting to follow up on parent emails, and feeling emotionally distant from children who needed her attention. During a parent-teacher conference in January, Marcus's mother asked if everything was okay because Marcus had mentioned that Mrs. Martinez seemed sad lately. "I'm fine," Sarah had assured her, but the conversation haunted her. If an 8-year-old could sense her emotional state, she clearly wasn't hiding her struggles as well as she thought. Her students deserved better than a teacher who was barely functioning. The financial reality of her new life was also more challenging than she had expected. Even with careful budgeting, Sarah found herself dipping into her savings account monthly to cover unexpected expenses: car repairs, medical bills, the higher utility costs of an inefficient apartment. The $87,000 that had seemed like a substantial cushion was slowly shrinking, and Sarah began to panic about her long-term financial security. By February, she was spending sleepless nights calculating and recalculating her budget, trying to figure out how to make her money last. At her current rate of spending, the savings would be gone within 5 years, leaving her with nothing but her teacher's salary and whatever small retirement pension she might eventually qualify for. The prospect of renting apartments for the rest of her life, never again having equity or stability or a place that was truly her own, felt like a future too bleak to contemplate. But the lowest point came in March, when Sarah learned that David and Jessica had gotten engaged. The news reached her through a mutual friend who thought Sarah should know before seeing it on social media. David was planning a summer wedding and had been telling people that his first marriage had simply run its course, that sometimes people grow apart, and divorce is the healthiest option for everyone involved. There was no mention of the 8 years Sarah had devoted to their relationship, no acknowledgement of the sacrifices she had made or the dreams they had shared. Their marriage had been reduced to a footnote in his life story, something that hadn't worked out but had led him to find true love with someone else. Sarah felt erased, as if her entire adult life up to that point had been declared meaningless by the person who had shared it with her. That night, sitting alone in her generic apartment, Sarah reached the darkest moment of her entire ordeal. She looked around at the beige walls, the rental furniture, the life that felt like a placeholder for something real that might never come. Her savings were dwindling, her career felt stagnant, her confidence was shattered, and the future stretched ahead like an endless series of similar apartments and similar compromises. For the first time since the divorce proceedings began, Sarah allowed herself to cry, not the controlled tears of grief she had shed before, but the desperate sobs of someone who felt completely lost and overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control. She cried for the marriage that had failed, for the house that had been sold, for the future that would never happen, and for the version of herself that had believed hard work and good intentions were enough to build a secure life. But what Sarah couldn't know in that moment of deepest despair was that sometimes you have to lose everything you think you want before you can discover what you're truly capable of achieving. Sometimes the lowest point isn't the end of your story, it's the beginning of your transformation. And sometimes the best way to move forward isn't to accept the limitations that circumstances seem to impose, but to find the courage to create possibilities that didn't exist before. What happened next would prove that Sarah Martinez was about to discover strength, skills, and determination she never knew she possessed, and that 3 years later, she would be standing in the doorway of 1247 Maple Grove Drive, not as someone who had lost her dream home, but as someone who had earned the power to reclaim it. The turning point came on a Saturday morning in April 2022, when Sarah found herself driving aimlessly through Austin neighborhoods, something she had started doing on weekends when the silence of her apartment became unbearable. She had no particular destination in mind, just a need to be somewhere other than her rental unit with its thin walls and constant reminders of everything she had lost. She was driving through the Riverside district, an area she had rarely visited during her marriage, when she noticed a small house with a "for sale" sign in the front yard. The house was clearly in distress: peeling paint, overgrown landscaping, a front porch that sagged slightly on one side. But something about it caught her attention, and she found herself pulling over to look more closely. The listing flyer in the plastic box attached to the sign showed basic details: 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, 200 square feet, built in 1954. The asking price was $68,000, which seemed impossibly low for Austin's inflated real estate market. Sarah took a photo of the listing information and drove home, curious despite herself about why the house was priced so aggressively. That evening, She researched the property online and discovered it was an estate sale. The elderly owner had passed away, and her children, who lived out of state, wanted to sell quickly rather than invest in repairs. The house needed significant work: new flooring, updated electrical, bathroom renovations, and exterior painting at minimum. Most potential buyers were either investors looking for rental properties or homeowners with substantial renovation budgets. But as Sarah studied the listing photos and read the description, an idea began to form. She had 8 years of experience improving homes, skills she had developed through necessity and passion during her time in the Victorian house. She understood how to strip paint, refinish floors, install fixtures, and coordinate repairs. What if, instead of watching her savings slowly disappear while she paid rent to live in someone else's generic apartment, she used that money to buy and renovate a house she could actually own? The idea was terrifying and completely outside her comfort zone. Sarah had never considered real estate investment or property flipping. She was a school teacher who had stumbled into home improvement by necessity and love, not someone who understood construction timelines, contractor management, or renovation budgets. But the alternative, continuing to rent while her savings dwindled and her dreams remained permanently deferred, felt even more frightening. She called the listing agent the following Monday. Janet Morrison had been selling real estate in Austin for 15 years and was used to working with investors. But Sarah's questions were different from the typical buyer inquiries she received. "I'm not an investor," Sarah explained. "I'm a teacher, and I'm thinking about buying this house to renovate and live in myself. But I need to understand what I'm getting into." Janet was intrigued enough to offer to meet Sarah at the property the following evening. The house was worse in person than the photos had suggested, but it was also more structurally sound than Sarah had feared. The foundation was solid, the roof was in decent condition, and the electrical system, while outdated, was functional and safe. "The bones are good," Janet said as they walked through the empty rooms. "It needs cosmetic work more than structural work, which is why it's priced to move." "Are you handy with tools?" Sarah explained her experience with the Victorian home, the projects she had completed, and the skills she had developed. Janet listened carefully and then made a suggestion that would change everything. "You know, there's a whole community of people doing what you're thinking about, buying distressed properties, fixing them up, and either living in them or selling them for profit. Have you ever heard of house flipping?" Sarah had heard the term, but never seriously considered it as something she could do. House flipping seemed like the domain of contractors and real estate professionals, not elementary school teachers with modest savings accounts. "There's a group that meets monthly," Janet continued. "Real Estate Investment Association of Austin. It's mostly small-time investors, people who buy 1 or 2 houses a year, fix them up, and either rent them out or sell them. You should come to a meeting." That evening, Sarah went home and spent hours researching house flipping, real estate investment, and property renovation. She learned about concepts she had never considered: ARV, after repair value, renovation budgets, holding costs, and profit margins. She discovered online communities where people shared renovation stories, budget breakdowns, and lessons learned from both successful and failed projects. The REIA meeting was held the 3rd Tuesday of each month at a community center in South Austin. Sarah almost didn't go. She felt like an imposter among serious investors who would surely recognize immediately that she had no business being there. But on April 19th, she forced herself to walk into that room full of strangers and sit down at a folding table with a paper nameplate that read, "Sarah Martinez, new member." The meeting changed her perspective completely. The group wasn't dominated by wealthy developers or professional contractors, as she had imagined. Instead, it was full of people like herself, teachers, nurses, office workers, retirees, who had discovered they could improve their financial situations by buying distressed properties and renovating them. Some focused on rental income, others on flipping houses for profit, but all had started with limited experience and modest budgets. The guest speaker that evening was Maria Rodriguez, a former social worker who had started flipping houses 3 years earlier after her own divorce. She shared her story of buying her first property with $12,000 down, renovating it over 6 months while living in it, and selling it for a profit of $38,000. I had never held a power drill before I bought my first house, Maria told the group. But YouTube became my best friend, and I learned that most home improvement projects are less complicated than they seem. The key is starting with a property that has good bones and not getting overwhelmed by the cosmetic issues that scare away other buyers. After the meeting, Sarah approached Maria and explained her situation. Maria listened carefully and then offered advice that would prove invaluable. That riverside property you described sounds perfect for a first project, Maria said. The price point gives you room for mistakes. The neighborhood is improving, and you already have more renovation experience than I did when I started. But you need to get the house inspected thoroughly and create a realistic budget before you make an offer. Over the following weeks, Sarah threw herself into learning everything she could about real estate investment. She read books about house flipping, watched renovation videos on YouTube, and attended every REIA meeting and workshop she could find. She learned how to estimate renovation costs, evaluate neighborhood trends, and calculate potential profits. More importantly, she began to see a path forward that didn't involve watching her savings disappear while living in other people's properties. If she could successfully renovate the riverside house, she could either live in it mortgage-free or sell it for a profit and use that money to buy and flip another property. Instead of being a victim of circumstances beyond her control, she could become someone who created opportunities for herself. Sarah made an offer on the riverside property in early May, $58,000, contingent on a satisfactory inspection. The sellers accepted immediately, eager to close quickly and move on with settling the estate. The inspection revealed exactly what Sarah expected: cosmetic issues that looked overwhelming but were mostly superficial, and solid structural elements that would support whatever improvements she wanted to make. The closing was scheduled for June 15, 2022. Sarah would put down $25,000 and finance the remainder with a renovation loan she had qualified for through a local credit union. The loan officer, initially skeptical about lending to a teacher with no investment experience, had been impressed by the detailed renovation budget Sarah presented and her obvious knowledge of the work required. But what happened in the weeks leading up to closing would test Sarah's resolve in unexpected ways. David, who had been silent since their divorce was finalized, reached out through Margaret to express concern about Sarah's decision to buy a fixer-upper with her settlement money. "He's worried you're making a mistake," Margaret explained during a phone call. "He thinks you should keep renting and invest the money conservatively instead of risking it on real estate." Sarah's initial reaction was anger. David had forfeited any right to have opinions about her financial decisions when he chose to end their marriage and force the sale of their home. But the deeper issue was that his concerns echoed her own fears that she was taking too big a risk, that she would fail at this venture and lose everything she had left. The night before closing, Sarah lay awake in her apartment staring at the ceiling and questioning every decision she had made. Was she being reckless with money she couldn't afford to lose? Was she trying to prove something to David and Jessica, whose engagement announcement had triggered this entire chain of events? Was she capable of successfully managing a renovation project from start to finish without the emotional support of a partner? But as the hours passed, Sarah realized that her fears were less about the practical aspects of house flipping and more about her own self-doubt. The divorce had shaken her confidence in her judgment, her ability to make good decisions, and her capacity to build a secure future independently. Buying and renovating the riverside house wasn't just a financial investment, it was an investment in rebuilding her belief in herself. The closing took place at 10 o'clock. On a Thursday morning at the title company office downtown, Sarah signed document after document, transferred $25,000 from her savings account, and received the keys to 847 Riverside Drive, her first investment property and the beginning of what would become an extraordinary transformation. As she drove to the house after closing, Sarah felt a mixture of terror and excitement that was entirely different from any emotion she had experienced during the divorce proceedings. For the first time in over a year, she was moving toward something instead of away from something. She was no longer a victim of circumstances beyond her control, but someone who was actively creating new possibilities for her future. Standing in the empty living room of her new house, looking at peeling wallpaper and worn carpet that would soon be transformed, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since before David asked for a divorce: hope. Not hope that someone else would rescue her or that circumstances would improve on their own, but hope that she had the power to build exactly the life she wanted. What she couldn't have known standing in that modest house in May 2022 was that this purchase would be the first step in a journey that would completely transform not just her financial situation, but her understanding of what she was capable of achieving. Within 18 months, Sarah would own 3 rental properties and have completed 5 successful flips. Within 3 years, she would be in a position to pay cash for any house in Austin, including 1247 Maple Grove Drive, where her story had begun with such devastating loss. Sarah's alarm clock buzzed at 5:30 a.m. on Monday, June 20th, 2022, just as it had every school morning for the past 8 years. But instead of preparing for another day of teaching third graders, she was beginning her summer break with a project that would test every skill she had ever developed and several she hadn't yet acquired. Today marked the first official day of renovating 847 Riverside Drive, and Sarah had 3 months to transform it from a distressed property into her new home. She arrived at the house by 6 a.m., coffee in hand, wearing old jeans and a t-shirt she had designated for demolition work. The first task was removing the dated wallpaper from the living room and dining area, a job that would be tedious but satisfying, stripping away decades of other people's decorating choices to reveal the clean walls underneath. The wallpaper removal took 3 full days, but Sarah found the work meditative rather than frustrating. Each strip that came away represented not just cosmetic improvement, but psychological progress. She was literally peeling away the past to create space for something new. When she finally saw the clean, dry wall underneath, ready for fresh paint, she felt a sense of accomplishment that had been missing from her life since the divorce. YouTube became her constant companion during those first weeks. Sarah would start each morning by researching the day's project: how to remove laminate flooring, how to install new baseboards, how to replace outdated light fixtures. She would watch several videos about each task, take detailed notes, and then attempt the work herself. When she inevitably encountered problems or complications, she would return to her phone for troubleshooting videos. Learning as she went, the process was slower than she had initially estimated, but faster than she had feared. Sarah discovered that her experience with the Victorian home had given her a solid foundation in home improvement basics. She knew how to use power tools safely, how to measure accurately, and how to work systematically through complex projects. More importantly, she had developed the patience and problem-solving skills that renovation work required. By the end of June, she had removed all the old flooring, updated most of the light fixtures, and painted the entire interior of the house in colors she had chosen carefully: warm whites and soft grays that would appeal to potential buyers while still feeling welcoming to live in herself. The transformation was already dramatic, and Sarah began to understand why Maria Rodriguez had described house flipping as addictive. But the real breakthrough came in July, when Sarah decided to tackle the kitchen renovation herself rather than hiring contractors. The existing kitchen was functional but dated, with laminate countertops, basic cabinets, and appliances that belonged in the 1990s. Sarah's budget allowed for either professional installation of a modest kitchen or DIY installation of a much more impressive one. She chose to do the work herself, learning to install kitchen cabinets, cut and fit countertops, and coordinate plumbing and electrical work pushed Sarah far beyond her previous skill level. There were moments of frustration when measurements didn't match, when cabinets didn't align properly, or when she had to call in professional help for tasks beyond her capabilities. But there were also moments of pure triumph, like when the new quartz countertops were installed perfectly, or when the subway tile backsplash was completed exactly as she had envisioned. The kitchen renovation took 5 weeks, but the result was stunning. Sarah had created a space that looked like it belonged in a home twice the price of what she had paid. More importantly, she had proven to herself that she could master complex projects through determination, research, and careful attention to detail. Word of Sarah's renovation began to spread through her network of teacher friends and REIA members. People started stopping by to see the progress, and their reactions convinced Sarah that she had chosen the right project for her skill level and budget. But the real validation came in August, when she decided to have the house appraised to see how much equity she had created. The appraisal came back at $98,000, a $30,000 increase over her purchase price. After subtracting her renovation costs of $18,000 and closing costs, Sarah had created $12,000 in equity through 3 months of hard work. But more than the financial gain, she had created something beautiful and valuable with her own hands, and she had done it entirely on her own terms. As the summer ended and the new school year approached, Sarah faced a decision she hadn't anticipated when she bought the house. The renovation was essentially complete, and she could either move in as planned or sell the property and use the profits to buy another fixer-upper. The house was beautiful and would make a comfortable home, but Sarah found herself more excited about the possibility of taking on another renovation challenge. Maria Rodriguez provided the guidance Sarah needed to make her decision. "The question isn't whether you should keep this house or sell it," Maria explained over coffee at their monthly REIA meeting. "The question is what you want your life to look like in 5 years. Do you want to own one nice house, or do you want to own multiple properties that generate income and wealth?" Sarah had never thought about real estate as a path to wealth building, but Maria's question forced her to consider possibilities she hadn't previously imagined. What if instead of returning to her apartment and settling for a modest teacher's lifestyle, she continued flipping houses and building a portfolio of rental properties? What if she could create financial independence that would give her choices she had never had before? The decision to sell 847 Riverside Drive was made easier by an unexpected development. A neighbor who had watched Sarah's renovation work approached her in early September with an offer to buy the house for $102,000, $4,000 more than the appraised value. The neighbor's daughter was starting college at UT and needed a place to live, and the family preferred buying from someone they had watched improve the property rather than dealing with real estate agents and uncertain outcomes. Sarah accepted the offer immediately. After paying off her renovation loan, covering selling costs, and calculating her total investment, she had made a net profit of $28,000 on her first house flip. Combined with her remaining divorce settlement money, she now had enough capital to take on a larger and potentially more profitable project. But what happened next exceeded even Sarah's expanding vision for her future. At the September REIA meeting, she met Tom Patterson, a contractor who specialized in buying distressed properties at courthouse auctions and renovating them for resale. Tom was looking for a partner, someone with renovation skills who could oversee projects while he handled the purchasing and contracting aspects of the business. "I've heard about your Riverside flip," Tom told Sarah after the meeting. "People are impressed with the quality of your work and how quickly you completed it. I buy 4 or 5 properties a year, but I'm getting too busy to manage all the renovations myself. Would you be interested in partnering on some projects?" Sarah's initial reaction was that she wasn't qualified to partner with an experienced investor, but Tom's proposal was structured to minimize her risk while maximizing her learning opportunities. He would handle property acquisition and major structural work, while she would manage interior renovations and design decisions. Profits would be split based on their respective investments of time and money, and Sarah would gain experience with larger, more complex projects. Their first partnership project was a 1960s ranch house in South Austin that Tom purchased at auction for $45,000. The house needed extensive work: new flooring throughout, complete bathroom renovations, kitchen updates, exterior painting, and landscaping. But the neighborhood was gentrifying rapidly, and comparable renovated homes were selling for $160,000 or more. Working with Tom expanded Sarah's capabilities dramatically. She learned to coordinate multiple contractors, manage renovation timelines, and make design decisions that balanced cost efficiency with market appeal. More importantly, she learned to think strategically about real estate investment, analyzing neighborhood trends, understanding buyer preferences, and calculating profit margins with precision. The South Austin ranch flip took 4 months to complete and sold for $173,000. After all expenses, Sarah's share of the profits was $31,000, more than she had made in her best year of teaching. But beyond the financial success, she had discovered that she possessed talents she had never recognized during her years in the classroom. By the end of 2022, less than a year after her first house purchase, Sarah had completed 2 flips and was already under contract on a 3rd property. Her divorce settlement money had grown rather than shrunk, and she was earning more from real estate investment than from teaching. But the most dramatic change wasn't in her bank account. It was in her confidence and her vision for what her life could become. The Sarah Martinez who sat crying in her beige apartment in March 2022, devastated by divorce and terrified of the future, had been replaced by someone who woke up each morning excited about the project she was creating and the possibilities that lay ahead. She had discovered that losing everything she thought she wanted had freed her to discover what she was truly capable of achieving. But what Sarah didn't yet realize was that her transformation was only beginning. In 2023, she would complete 6 more house flips, purchase her first rental property, and accumulate enough wealth to consider investments she had never dreamed possible. And in the spring of 2024, she would receive a phone call that would present her with the opportunity to reclaim not just her financial security, but the very house where her journey of loss and recovery had begun. The phone call would come from Patricia Williams, the real estate agent who had helped sell 1247 Maple Grove Drive during Sarah's divorce. Patricia would have news that would test everything Sarah had learned about forgiveness, about moving forward, and about the difference between getting revenge and getting justice. The Victorian house on Maple Grove Drive was about to come back on the market, and Sarah would have to decide whether reclaiming her past was worth the price it might exact on the future she had built. The phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon in March 2024, while Sarah was reviewing renovation plans for her latest project, a mid-century modern home in the increasingly desirable East Austin neighborhood. She almost didn't answer the unfamiliar number, but something made her pick up on the 4th ring. "Sarah, this is Patricia Williams. I helped you sell your home on Maple Grove Drive a few years ago." Sarah's pen stopped moving across the blueprints. Patricia Williams, the cheerful real estate agent who had hammered that "for sale" sign into the front yard of her dream home during the worst period of her life. "I hope you don't mind me calling," Patricia continued, "but I wanted to give you first right of refusal on something. The house at 1247 Maple Grove Drive is about to come back on the market." For a moment, Sarah couldn't speak. The Victorian home where she had refinished floors, painted cabinets, and installed that beautiful front door with such love and hope, the home she'd been forced to sell when David demanded a divorce, was available again. What happened? She finally managed to ask. "The couple who bought it from you are getting divorced themselves," Patricia explained. "It's a messy situation and they need to sell quickly. They're asking $950,000, but I think they'd take less for a cash offer and quick closing. $950,000. The house she had been forced to sell for $650,000 was now worth almost $1 million. But what struck Sarah even more than the price was the irony. Another couple's marriage had failed in the same house where hers had ended. "I don't know if you're interested," Patricia continued, "but I remember how much that house meant to you. I thought you should know it's available before it goes on the market publicly." After hanging up, Sarah sat in her home office, the 3rd house she had bought and renovated for herself since that first Riverside flip, and considered the implications of Patricia's call. Over the past 2 years, her real estate investment business had grown beyond anything she had initially imagined. She now owned 4 rental properties, had completed 11 successful flips, and had accumulated enough liquid capital to make a cash offer on nearly any house in Austin. But buying back her former home would mean more than just another real estate transaction. It would mean confronting the most painful period of her life, revisiting decisions and relationships that had nearly destroyed her, and potentially undoing the emotional progress she had made since the divorce. Sarah called Tom Patterson, her business partner, to discuss the opportunity from a purely financial perspective. The numbers were compelling. The house was priced below current market value for the neighborhood, and her improvements from 2019-2021 had likely added significant long-term value. But Tom raised questions that went beyond financial analysis. "Are you sure you want to go backward?" he asked. "You've built an amazing life and business. Why risk getting emotionally entangled with a property that represents such a difficult time?" It was a fair question, but as Sarah considered it, she realized that buying back the Maple Grove house wouldn't represent going backward at all. It would represent the completion of a transformation that had begun with devastating loss and evolved into extraordinary strength and capability. The woman who had been forced to sell that house had been financially dependent, emotionally fragile, and professionally limited. The woman who could buy it back was none of those things. Sarah made an offer of $875,000 cash with a 2-week closing. The sellers accepted immediately, eager to settle their own divorce quickly and move on with their separate lives. But what Sarah discovered during the final walkthrough would provide the perfect ending to her journey of loss and reclamation. David and Jessica were there, not as owners. They had never owned the house, but as tenants. After their wedding in 2022, they had rented the Victorian home from the couple who had bought it from Sarah. Their marriage had lasted less than 18 months, and Jessica was now living alone in the house while their own divorce was finalized. The moment when Jessica opened the front door that Sarah had installed with her own hands was one of perfect, poetic justice. Jessica clearly recognized Sarah immediately, and the expression on her face shifted from confusion to comprehension to something approaching panic. "Sarah?" Jessica's voice was barely a whisper. "What are you doing here?" "I'm the new owner," Sarah replied calmly, stepping into the entryway she had renovated with such care and hope. "You have 30 days to vacate according to the lease terms." What followed was a conversation that provided Sarah with closure she hadn't realized she needed. Jessica, facing her own divorce and financial uncertainty, broke down and apologized for the role she had played in destroying Sarah's marriage. She talked about how guilty she had felt, how David had promised her that his marriage was already over when they began their relationship, and how she had come to understand that someone who would leave one wife for another woman might eventually leave that woman for someone else. Sarah listened with compassion but not sympathy. She had moved beyond anger or the need for revenge. Jessica's apology was appreciated but unnecessary. Sarah's life was now so much better than it would have been if David had never asked for a divorce that she felt almost grateful for the betrayal that had forced her transformation. "I'm sorry about your marriage," Sarah said, and she meant it. "But you don't need to apologize to me. What happened between you and David led me to discover capabilities I never knew I had. I'm happier now than I ever was when I lived here before." As Jessica gathered her belongings and prepared to leave the house she had never truly owned, Sarah walked through the rooms that had once represented her dreams and now represented her triumph. The sage green kitchen cabinets she had painted were still beautiful. The hardwood floors she had refinished still gleamed. The front door she had installed still opened smoothly on hinges she had adjusted to perfection. But the woman walking through those rooms was fundamentally different from the one who had been forced to leave them 3 years earlier. Sarah Martinez was no longer someone who had lost her home to divorce. She was someone who had built a business, accumulated wealth, and created opportunities that gave her choices she had never imagined possible. The house on Maple Grove Drive would become her primary residence once again, but it would also serve as headquarters for her expanding real estate investment business. She converted the 3rd floor into a design studio where she planned renovations for the properties she continued to flip and upgrade. The basement became a workshop where she stored tools and materials for her various projects. But perhaps most importantly, the house became a symbol of one of the most powerful truths about human resilience, that sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you becomes the catalyst for the best thing that can happen to you. Sarah's forced sale of her dream home had led directly to her discovery of talents, skills, and possibilities she never would have explored if her marriage had continued. By the end of 2024, Sarah owned 12 rental properties, had completed over 20 successful house flips, and had accumulated enough wealth to retire from teaching if she chose. But she continued working in the classroom 3 days a week because she loved the work, not because she needed the income. Her students benefited from having a teacher who was financially secure, professionally confident, and personally fulfilled in ways that made her more patient, creative, and inspiring in the classroom. Sarah's story illustrates 5 crucial lessons that anyone facing devastating setbacks can apply to their own journey of recovery and transformation. First, what looks like the end of your story might actually be the beginning of your best chapter. Sarah's divorce felt like complete failure, but it freed her from limitations she didn't even recognize had been constraining her growth and potential. Second, skills you develop during happy times become invaluable resources during difficult times. Sarah's home improvement experience, gained during her marriage, became the foundation for a business that transformed her life after divorce. Third, sometimes you have to lose your safety net to discover what you're truly capable of achieving. As long as Sarah could rely on David's income and their shared financial stability, she had no reason to explore her own capacity for wealth building and independence. Fourth, the best revenge isn't getting even. It's getting so much better that your former circumstances look like limitations you've outgrown. Sarah didn't need to hurt David or Jessica to feel vindicated. Her success spoke louder than any confrontation could have. Finally, true transformation happens not when your circumstances improve, but when you develop the skills and mindset to improve any circumstances you encounter. Sarah didn't just recover from divorce, she became someone who could thrive regardless of external challenges. If you're facing what feels like the end of everything you planned and worked toward, remember Sarah's journey from devastating loss to extraordinary success. Your current crisis might be preparing you for opportunities you can't yet imagine. The skills you're developing to survive your worst days might become the foundation for your best years. The house at 1247 Maple Grove Drive stands today not as a monument to what Sarah lost, but as a testament to what she gained. Every room tells the story of a woman who discovered that losing everything she thought she needed gave her the motivation to build everything she never knew she wanted. What challenges are you facing that could become the catalyst for your own transformation? What skills do you have that could be developed into something greater than you've imagined? What would be possible if you approached your setbacks not as obstacles to overcome, but as opportunities to discover capabilities you never knew you possessed? Sarah Martinez proved that sometimes the best response to someone taking your dream is to build a reality so much better that the original dream looks small in comparison. Her story continues today as she helps other people navigate their own property investments and life transformations, proving that the most powerful comebacks aren't about returning to where you started. They're about becoming someone who could never be diminished by the circumstances that once seemed insurmountable. Sometimes you don't get the house, you get something infinitely more valuable. You get the unshakable knowledge that you can build anything you need, recover from any loss, and create possibilities that didn't exist before you had the courage to try. That's exactly what Sarah Martinez discovered, and it's waiting for anyone brave enough to turn their greatest loss into their most extraordinary opportunity for growth. If this story inspired you to see your own challenges differently, please subscribe to our channel for more real stories about people who turn their setbacks into comebacks. And tell us in the comments about a time when losing something you wanted led you to discover something even better. Because your story of resilience could be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.